But as we looked around at our neighbors, the only Hispanics we saw were under our very own roof. So it was my father who became the strange, strange figure in this landscape. He was a man with a heavy Spanish accent who refused to be anything like the golfing, happy-go-lucky, wonderful American daddies down the street. He was the one who was always correcting our Spanish and telling us to get inside and sit down and mind our manners, and por Dios, put on your shoes. Ironically, even when we got to Summit, New Jersey, my mother didn't win the cultural battle completely. They're still fighting that battle. They're 91 and 96 years old, and they're still fighting every day. No, she didn't win, not really. We continued to be raised in Summit as if we were in a Peruvian house. From the moment we came in the front door, we could smell Peru. There was a little lomo saltado or ají de gallina on the stove, and my father's nostalgic Peruvian vases on the record player, and the floors were covered with llama rugs, and the walls were covered with Andean landscapes and representations of the Inca sun. What few non-Peruvian paintings we had, and I do remember we had a few, there were a couple by Thomas Gainsborough, had actually been painted by Peruvian Indian hands. They were reproductions, of course. My mother was so grateful to be back in her own country. She was happy to indulge my father. And so a Peruvian house it became. I didn't realize it until I was much older, but we also went on living by Peruvian rules. On Christmas, Santa Claus didn't come to our house. He made bold and generous appearances down the street, up and down the street. But we got the 3 canes, and we got one good present. And on Easter, there was no Easter bunny. There were religious little medallions, as we would have gotten in Peru. And when there were field trips, everybody else in school would come to the bus with their tiny little sandwiches and tiny little saran wrap. And I would come with rice and beans. Later, when I became a teenager in high school, I didn't go out with boys on a date without my older brother, who came along and just to watch over things. I loved Georgie, but he was always cutting in at school dances and dispatching the naughty boys, who were actually all the handsome boys, across the room. Every day, when we children walked out of our house, we stepped into the United States of America. And every evening, when we walked back in, we came home to Peru. There's a wonderful Chilean writer, I don't know if you know his name, Antonio Scarmeta, who wrote a book called, wonderful little book called Il Postino, the postman. Oh, yes. It was made into a movie about the man who delivered mail to the great poet Pablo Neruda. And Antonio Scarmeta once said this about children who come to live in a new culture, and I quote him: "The hardest thing a human being can live through, outside of war or starvation, is a desire to be something other than he or she is." Something other than he or she is. That's the work that an immigrant child does every day. My brother and sister and I wanted to shuck our Peruvianness and be just like everybody else around us. We wanted to be carbon copies of our American neighbors, of the kids at the school. We wanted desperately to be other than what we were. I'm telling you all this because I didn't really become that other thing, that red, white, and blue American, until I came to Northwestern University. It was here on my own, away from that fierce hold of family, that I came to understand what it means to be a person of these United States, to be immersed in a culture that maybe many Americans take for granted, to live in a universe that was unabashedly and proudly American through and through. Now, most people go away to college and experience a kind of rebirth of sorts. Suddenly you're away from your parents, you can redefine yourself, you can become the person that you truly want to be. But for me, there was an extra cultural component to that metamorphosis. Here I was surrounded by Americans from all over the country, living day in and day out with one friend who'd come from San Francisco and another friend who'd come from Stamford, Connecticut, which, when you think about it, is the equivalent of between, say, Mexico City and Sao Paulo, or between London and Baku. And yet they spoke exactly the same language, used the same slang, had the same habits, shared the same jokes, wore the same clothes. Now, this may strike the ordinary American undergraduate as a simple, obvious fact, but to me it was absolutely flabbergasting. So along with the Russian classes and the French classes, history, chemistry, biology, I was learning a great deal about the broader American culture. I was learning what it means to be a curious, questioning, even dissenting, but always participating American citizen. Now, let's not forget what kind of America this Peruvian kid walked into. My mother had promised a paradise, and it was, in a way. The streets seemed so pristine, the stores were so full, the people seemed so prosperous, but it was also the 1960s, and the country was in the throes of an identity crisis. The year after we arrived from Peru, the very bright, handsome president that America had just elected was shot in the full light of day on the streets of Dallas. A few years after that, we all watched young black Americans get hosed by the National Guard for no other reason than because they wanted to attend public high school. We watched a heart-rending march from Selma to Montgomery. We worried about the Soviet menace. And then, of course, there was the Vietnam War. This was no charmed life on a sugar plantation in Baramonga, Peru. Every year, in the 4 years that I was at Northwestern, the country seemed to face some kind of crucible. 1967, my freshman year, also Liz's, began with Vietnam War protesters marching on the nation's capital. Many Northwesterners actually hitchhiked east that October to be part of that protest. By the time I graduated in 1971, we had lived through the Tet Offensive, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the race riots in Chicago, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, the Days of Rage, the Weathermen facing off against the Chicago police, a black student sitting right here at the university's bursar's office, and a week-long student strike by all Northwestern students after the Kent State Massacre. I remember the cast of the WAMU show getting ready to perform on that fateful day in May of 1970 when we heard about the shootings in Kent, Ohio. The director wanted to go on with the show, but the student performers were torn. We were feeling that we should mark these deaths in some way. We decided not to go on strike, but to wear black armbands. We would wear them during every skit, no matter what our costume was. The curtain went up, the rousing opening number commenced, the dancers flew on stage with their black armbands in place. There was a murmur of displeasure in the audience. When the curtain went up the second time, on the second skit, and the armbands were still there, over a totally new set of costumes, there was such an uproar in the audience that they rose up out of their seats, threw their programs at us, and walked out. It wasn't an easy time. I remember lying on my back on the green grass in front of my sorority house that spring and staring up at the clouds as the sounds of Procol Harum's A Whiter Shade of Pale boomed out across campus, and thinking that I was very, very far away from Peru. And I remember the slow realization that even as all the worldly tumult and chaos came and went, there was always a class I had to go to, a professor who expected something of me, a subject to comprehend and learn, and that meant, of course, that I was learning one of the greatest of American lessons. We are the patient accrual of small daily efforts.